the silent betrayal, a husband's shadow. In the heart of the sprawling city of Viridian, where gleaming skyscrapers kissed the heavens and the hum of ambition never ceased, there lived a man named Elias. His life appeared ordinary to those who glanced upon it. An office worker in his late 30s, living in a quiet, unassuming apartment with his wife, Celine. To the world, their marriage was one of contentment, a gentle union of two people navigating the tide of life. But behind the walls of their home, beneath the smiles and the pleasantries, a darkness had begun to fester, a darkness only Elias could see. Celine, once the love of his life, had become a stranger. She had grown distant, her once radiant laughter now replaced with moments of silence, and Elias, though aware of the growing rift, had hoped it was just a passing phase, a natural ebb and flow of time. But deep in his gut, he knew something more sinister was at play. It started subtly, a few late nights at work, vague answers to his questions, and a lingering unease in the air. He trusted her, of course. He trusted her completely, until the day he stumbled upon a receipt tucked into the back of her purse, a receipt that sent a shiver down his spine. It was from an upscale restaurant, a place far too expensive for their usual dinner outings. The date written on it was the same night she had claimed to be working late, the same night she had promised to attend a business dinner. But there were no co-workers listed on the receipt, only one name, Julian. Julian, her boss. Elias's heart raced as he scanned the receipt. He had heard whispers in the office about Julian's charisma, his influence, his ability to command the room, and now Elias was beginning to piece together a story he could hardly believe, yet could not deny. The once unshakable trust he had in Celine seemed to crumble, like sand slipping through his fingers. That night, as the moon hung low in the sky, Elias lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. His mind whirled with the possibilities, each one darker than the last. He could confront her, demand the truth, but something told him that would not be enough. No, he needed to understand the full extent of the betrayal before he acted. He needed to see it with his own eyes. The plot unfolds. Elias wasn't a man, prone to rash decisions. He was patient, meticulous, and methodical. He decided to play the long game. If Celine and Julian believed they could keep their secret, then they had vastly underestimated him. Elias had spent years observing the world around him, learning its rhythms, its patterns, and its vulnerabilities. Now he would use that knowledge to expose the lies. He began by tracking Celine's movements. He studied her patterns when she left the house, when she came back. He planted small, subtle clues to see how she would react, testing her awareness of his suspicions. The signs were there, undeniable. A change in her routine, the way she glanced at her phone when he entered. The room, the hidden smiles she exchanged with Julian when she thought he wasn't looking. It was all starting to paint a picture, one that broke his heart and filled him with an intense, simmering rage. But Elias was not just a victim of his circumstances. He was a man with a plan. He knew the power of control, of manipulating the narrative. He would make them believe that their betrayal was unnoticed, that their lies were safe. He would allow them to think they were clever until the moment when the truth was revealed in the most devastating way possible. He began by befriending Julian, adopting a friendly, unassuming demeanor when they crossed paths in the office. Julian, confident and self-assured, had no idea that Elias was anything but a passive husband. They spoke of work, of business trends, of trivial things that only served to further mask Elias's true intentions. Elias played his part well, building trust, feeding Julian's ego with subtle compliments. In return, Julian opened up about his ambitions, his desires, some of which, Elias noticed, closely mirrored the exact behaviors he had observed in Celine. Elias carefully observed the way Julian interacted with his wife in meetings, the casual, touches on the arm, the lingering glances. Each small act was a thread in a tapestry that Elias was weaving. But it wasn't just about observation. Elias was also crafting a story, his story. He began to manipulate Celine's feelings, making her doubt her own choices. He planted seeds of doubt about her relationship with Julian, subtly suggesting that Julian's attention was more than professional, that the lines between colleague and something more had already been crossed. He fed her insecurities, playing on her fears, until she began to question not only Julian's intentions but her own. Celine, once confident in her ability to keep her secret, now found herself questioning everything. Revenge's embrace, the final play. The days after Elias's revelation were a blur of calculated moves and simmering rage. Celine, still reeling from the shock of Elias's knowing, spent the following days in a mixture of guilt, anger, and confusion. The weight of betrayal pressed upon her like 1,000-ton stone. She tried to avoid confronting him directly, but every corner of their home seemed to whisper of his knowing gaze, of the damning silence that hung between them. But Elias, for all his calm composure, had no intention of letting her, or Julian, escape the consequences of their betrayal so easily. The schemes begin. Elias was a man of intelligence, of patience. He had watched Celine and Julian, studied their every move, their every word, for months. Now he would make them pay. Not in the impulsive ways of revenge that involved yelling or wild confrontations, but in a more precise, methodical manner. A quiet destruction that would rip apart everything they held dear. His first move was subtle, almost imperceptible. He began to work behind the scenes in the corporate world they had both occupied. Elias had always been a quiet observer, a man who understood the power of influence and information. He'd worked hard to make a name for himself, though he'd never used his connections for anything but his own advancement. But now, it was different. Now, he had something to prove, not just to Celine, but to himself. It started with Julian's company, where Celine had worked as an executive assistant. Elias knew exactly where to strike. He'd planted a seed of doubt in the mind of one of Julian's competitors, feeding them just enough information about a financial discrepancy, one that was barely noticeable but could be blown out of proportion. The competitors quickly picked up the scent of scandal, launching an investigation into Julian's practices. Elias made sure to remain invisible, to let the whispers of suspicion grow louder with every passing day. It was a slow burn. Julian, now caught in a web of corporate suspicion, watched as his reputation began to erode. His business partners began to question his integrity. His clients, once loyal, began to distance themselves, unsure of the murky financials Elias had hinted at. The web tightens. Meanwhile, Celine's world began to crack from the inside out. Elias had carefully constructed a series of events that would expose the depths of her deceit. He knew she would try to regain control, to rebuild the image of the woman who had once been so meticulous, so perfect in her role. But every time she made an attempt to restore herself in the eyes of others, he was there, quietly pulling the strings. He'd manipulated the situation at work, subtly aligning himself with colleagues who could undermine her in ways she would never suspect. A casual remark here, a well-placed whisper there. The office gossip, once harmless, began to shift its focus onto her. Elias had engineered the perfect storm. Celine's professional reputation, once spotless, began to crumble. At home, their relationship grew colder. Elias no longer played the role of the passive husband. He was no longer the man who had been betrayed. He was the man who held all the cards, silent, observant, and unyielding. Celine had tried to confront him several times, each time finding herself met with an icy calmness that unnerved her. There were no tears, no accusations, just a quiet, penetrating gaze that spoke volumes. Elias was in control, and that was far more terrifying than any outburst of rage could ever be. The reckoning. The day Julian's downfall came was the day. Celine's world shattered completely. She had been working late again, just as she had so many times before, thinking that Elias's suspicions would fade with time. But as she sat in the conference room, reviewing numbers and preparing reports, she felt a subtle shift in the air. The phone rang, and her hands shook when she saw the name on the caller ID, Julian's assistant. "Celine, I'm afraid we need to talk." The assistant's voice crackled through the receiver. "There's been an investigation. There's talk of embezzlement, financial discrepancies traced back to Julian's department, and it looks like you're part of the inquiry." Her breath caught in her throat. Impossible, she thought. She had nothing to do with the scandal, but the pieces had already been set in motion. Elias had made sure of that. The office became a battleground of accusations. Celine found herself cornered, struggling to maintain the pristine image she had so carefully cultivated. The truth, however, was there, lurking beneath the surface. And as the days passed, it became clearer and clearer that Julian's downfall would take her down with him. She couldn't escape the chaos Elias had orchestrated. The moment of truth. It was a week later when Celine finally broke. The tension between her and Elias had become unbearable. The final stroke, the price of betrayal. In the days that followed the fallout, Elias felt a peculiar sense of emptiness settle within him. He had achieved everything he set out to do. Julian, once untouchable, had been completely exposed. His career, his reputation, and his financial security shattered beyond repair. Celine, the woman he had loved, had been forced to face the very real consequences of her actions. A woman reduced to nothing more than a shadow of the person she once was. But for Elias, revenge had been a bitter feast. It tasted sweet at first, sweet, with the satisfaction of having orchestrated their fall. Yet as time passed, it became a hollow victory. The gnawing emptiness in his chest grew louder. The silence in their home was deafening. But more than the silence itself was the realization that in destroying everything she held dear, he had lost a part of himself too. Elias had carefully crafted his strategy, ensuring that Celine would suffer the most. Her career had collapsed. Her social standing was in tatters. Julian, the man she had betrayed him with, was facing not only professional ruin, but personal disgrace. The whispers about them, about their secret affair and the financial misdeeds they had hidden, echoed in every corner of their world, and still, Celine was left fighting a battle she could never win. But as Elias watched her crumble, he couldn't shake the haunting thought that perhaps there was no true satisfaction in watching the woman who once held his heart fall apart. Revenge had become a prison of his own making. He had destroyed her life, yes, but in doing so, he had also destroyed any hope of redemption for both her and for himself. The moment of reflection. One quiet evening, as Elias sat alone in his apartment, a thought crossed his mind. A thought so unexpected it nearly shook him from his chair. He had spent so long plotting, so long waiting for his moment of triumph, that he had never stopped to consider what his ultimate goal had been. What had he hoped for? For Celine to beg for forgiveness? To fall at his feet, begging for mercy? Or had he truly wanted her to suffer, to pay for the wrongs she had done to him and their marriage? But now, in the stillness of the room, Elias realized something painful. Revenge had consumed him, and in the end, there was no true satisfaction in it. He had taken everything from her, but in doing so, he had allowed himself to become just like the man he despised. He had become a cold, vengeful person, someone who had allowed his pain to define him. It was as if he had become a mirror image of the betrayal he had once felt. The unexpected encounter days turned into weeks, and the bitterness in Elias's heart slowly began to fade, replaced with a haunting sense of regret. He no longer took joy in the destruction he had wrought. There were nights when he found himself staring at his reflection, asking himself who he had become in this pursuit of justice. He realized that the pursuit of revenge had made him forget the person he once was, the man who had once been capable of love, compassion, and hope. It was during this time, when his world was in turmoil and his thoughts were clouded with doubt, that fate intervened once again. Elias was at his favorite cafe, a small place near the river where he often went to escape the noise of his life. As he sat by the window, lost in his own thoughts, a figure approached, the figure he had not seen in months. Celine. She stood before him, looking different. Worn, yes, but there was something in her eyes that had not been there before. Oh, quiet vulnerability, a reflection of the broken woman she had become. Gone was the confident, calculated woman who had once deceived him. Now there was only a hollow shell, a person who had lost everything. "Why are you here?" Elias asked, his voice quieter than he expected. He had never anticipated a confrontation like this. He had assumed she would disappear into the shadows, never to be heard from again. But here she was, standing before him, as raw and exposed as the world had made her. "I wanted to apologize," Celine said, her voice shaky. "Not for what I did to you, but for the person I became, for the lies, for everything I took from you." Elias felt a strange tightening in his chest, the words unsettling him more than he expected. He had heard her apology before, but this felt different. This wasn't about salvaging anything for herself. It was an acknowledgement of the deep, irreparable damage she had caused. "I never meant for it to go this far," she continued, her eyes downcast. "I betrayed you, Elias, and I've lost everything because of it. My career, my dignity, even my own sense of self. But I never meant to hurt you like this. I didn't know how to stop. I thought I could control everything, that I could have both of you. But I was wrong. I lost myself in all of it." Elias looked at her, his mind racing. The unexpected call. Elias sat in his office one morning reviewing contracts when his phone rang. The number on the display was unfamiliar and his instinct told him not to answer. But something inside him, a mix of curiosity and dread, compelled him to pick up. "Elias!" the voice on the other end said, sharp and urgent. It was Julian's voice. Elias's pulse quickened. He had never expected to hear from Julian again. Their last interaction had been one of mutual disdain, but Julian's tone now was different. Gone was the arrogance and self-assurance that had once defined him. Now, there was only desperation. "Elias," Julian repeated, his voice strained, "I need your help." For a moment, Elias was frozen. Help? After everything that had happened? After the way Julian had treated him, betrayed him with Celine, after the destruction of their careers? The audacity of the request caught Elias off guard. "You're asking for help?" Elias finally managed to say, his voice laced with disbelief. "After everything that you and Celine did?" "I know," Julian replied, his words coming in quick, broken bursts. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve it, but He paused, as if gathering his thoughts. "I've made a terrible mistake, and I need someone to fix it." Elias's mind raced, the wounds of the past reopened by this unexpected intrusion. Why now, he wondered. Why after everything? "What's happened?" Elias asked, his curiosity now battling against his instincts to shut Julian out completely. "I'm being blackmailed," Julian confessed, his voice thick with panic. "Someone knows everything about Celine and me, about the financial misdealings. They're threatening to ruin me, everything I've built." Elias leaned back in his chair, the weight of Julian's words hanging heavy in the air. It wasn't just a simple threat. It was personal. Whoever had this information wasn't just after money. They were after vengeance, and it was clear that Julian was running out of options. "You think I can help you?" Elias's voice was cold, cutting through the silence between them. "I've made enemies, Elias. People who want to see me destroyed, and I don't know who to trust anymore. But I know one thing. You're the only person who could get me out of this." Elias was quiet for a moment. The old rage that had once consumed him resurfaced in a quiet, simmering way. He had the power to bring Julian's downfall to its ultimate conclusion. He could expose him completely, send him into a spiral from which there was no return. But there was something else in Julian's voice, a note of fear, perhaps even regret. Elias had never expected to hear that from the man who had stolen his wife, from the man who had destroyed his life. And yet, here he was, a broken shadow of his former self. The choice for days, Elias was torn. Part of him wanted to watch Julian burn. He wanted to see the man who had betrayed him suffer in the way he had once imagined. But another part of him, the part that had been growing steadily more silent over the months, wanted something different. He didn't want to become the man he had feared, the one consumed entirely by bitterness and hatred. In the end, Elias made a decision. The plan of action. Elias didn't help Julian out of kindness. He didn't do it because he had forgiven him. He did it because, for the first time in months, he wanted to prove something to himself, that he was stronger than revenge, that he could make a choice based on logic, not on the raw desire to destroy, that he could use his intellect and resources for something more strategic, more calculated. The plan he devised was not one of mercy, but of cold pragmatism. He would take down the people who had Julian in their grip. He would find the blackmailer, expose them, destroy them, but not for Julian's sake. He would do it to reclaim the last shred of control over the chaos that had upended his life. Elias worked in the shadows, carefully tracing the blackmailer's movements. The deeper he dug, the more he realized that the people threatening Julian were not the ones Julian had thought. They were connected to an even larger conspiracy, one that reached far beyond the personal betrayals that had once consumed Elias's life. The revelation. What Elias uncovered shook him to his core. The blackmailer was not just targeting Julian for money. They were using him as a pawn in a much larger scheme. The financial misdeeds, the affair, everything had been manipulated, staged, to distract from a much more dangerous game. It turned out that the scandal involving Julian and Selene had been orchestrated, not by Julian himself, but by someone with an agenda far darker than any of them had realized. As the truth unfolded before him, Elias was faced with the choice of exposing the blackmailer or walking away completely, leaving the wreckage of his past behind him. The desire for revenge was still there, but it had shifted into something else entirely. The reckoning. A price paid. Elias walked away from the blackmailer's fall with a sense of closure, but the past was never truly as easy to leave behind as one might hope. He had exacted his revenge, dismantled the web of lies, and even dealt a decisive blow to the forces that had once seemed untouchable. But deep down, he knew that while he had won the battle, the war was never truly over. Months passed, and as the dust from the scandal surrounding Julian and Selene settled, Elias found himself at a crossroads. His career had flourished, and his reputation as a master strategist had only strengthened. Yet every time he closed his eyes, there was an echo in the back of his mind, the faint pulse of an unresolved tension that no victory could silence. The past, in all its bitterness, still had a way of creeping back into his thoughts. But there was a shift in the air. Elias could sense that something was coming, something he hadn't expected, but knew was inevitable: the unexpected return. One morning, just as the sun began to break through the clouds over the city skyline, Elias received a call. The voice on the other end was familiar, but no less jarring. It was Celine. "Elias," she said, her tone softer than he had ever heard. "We need to talk." The words hung in the air for a moment, and Elias felt a cold wave of uncertainty wash over him. Why now, he thought. After everything that has happened? "I thought I had made myself clear, Celine," he replied, his voice tinged with the last remnants of the anger he had long tried to suppress. "I know," she said, almost pleading, "but I need you to understand. Things are not what they seem. There's more to everything that happened than you realize, and I owe you an explanation." Elias sat back in his chair, unsure of what to feel. The conversation could only go in one of two directions: a painful, regretful attempt at reconciliation, or the resurfacing of old wounds that had never truly healed. The unraveling of truth. They met at a quiet cafe, far from the prying eyes of the city. Celine looked different, older, more weary, as if the weight of her actions had finally caught up with her. She seemed smaller, diminished by the consequences of the choices she had made. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," Selena began, her eyes locked onto Elias's. "I've done too much to deserve that. But I need you to know something." Elias listened, his arms crossed, his gaze unyielding. "Julian didn't know everything," she continued, her voice breaking slightly. "When I betrayed you with him, it wasn't because I didn't love you. It was because I was lost. Julian was a symptom of a deeper problem, a way for me to escape from a marriage I didn't know how to fix. But the things you found out, the financial mess, the secrets, it wasn't entirely what it seemed." Elias's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I never knew Julian was involved with the blackmailer. I never knew he had deeper connections. Or that the whole thing was orchestrated. The affair was one thing, Elias. But the manipulation behind it, the lies, that wasn't us. That was someone else pulling the strings." Elias could feel the pulse of disbelief in his chest. The pieces were slowly starting to shift, but they weren't falling into place the way he expected. "Someone else?" Elias echoed. "Who?" Celine's eyes lowered, as if the weight of the truth was almost too much for her to bear. "Someone who wanted us all to be destroyed. Someone who knew that I was vulnerable, that Julian was desperate for success. The blackmailer, it wasn't just for money, it was for power. They were using us all to their advantage. And when you exposed Julian, they turned on you too. The true enemy." Elias's mind raced. The information was staggering. He had thought he understood the depths of the betrayal. He had thought that Julian and Celine were the root cause of it all. But now, he was faced with the reality that there was a far darker force at play, one that had used their weaknesses, their flaws, to destroy everything they held dear. "You're telling me that everything we went through, the financial disaster, the affair, the blackmail, was orchestrated by someone else?" Elias asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "And you didn't know?" Celine nodded, her eyes filled with remorse. "No. I was blind, Elias. I let myself be manipulated. I never thought Julian was capable of it either. But it wasn't about us. It was about something bigger. And I didn't realize it until it was too late." Elias stood, up abruptly, his thoughts churning like a storm. He had never imagined that the stakes would rise this high. Who could have been behind all this? "I need to find out who did this," he said, the determination returning to his voice. "Elias," Celine said, her hand reaching out toward him. "I can help. I owe you that much. I've been gathering information. I know things that I didn't before. We can stop this, together." The return of betrayal. Elias had thought that he had reached the end of his journey, The pain of Celine's betrayal had seemed distant now, faded by time and the careful rebuilding of his life. But sometimes the past has a way of creeping back into the present, of reopening wounds that seem to have healed. And so it was that, after years of careful distance, Elias found himself standing on the precipice of the one thing he never expected: betrayal again. It had all started with a late-night phone call, the kind of call that always comes with a sense of foreboding. He had been at his office, finishing up some final tasks before the weekend, when his phone buzzed. The name on the screen made his heart skip a beat: Celine. He hesitated for a long moment, considering not answering, but something deep inside urged him to pick up. Perhaps it's just about the kids, he thought. But he knew that wasn't true. His daughter was away at college, and his son had been with his ex-wife for the weekend. There was no logical reason for Celine to call him after all these years. When he finally answered, the voice on the other end wasn't the one he remembered, the one that was full of hope, warmth, and charm. Instead, it was quieter, more strained, and full of desperation. "Elias, I need to talk to you," Celine said, her voice trembling. "Talk to me? About what?" Elias replied, trying to keep the coldness in his voice. "After everything that happened? After everything you did?" I know I can't undo what I did. I don't expect you to forgive me," she said quickly. "But there's something you need to know. I'm in trouble, Elias. Big trouble." Elias felt a cold dread settle in the pit of his stomach. What trouble? The words she had spoken just moments ago sent an icy shiver through him. What could possibly be worse than what she'd already done? "Explain," he demanded, the sharpness of his voice betraying his concern. I'm with someone else," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I've made the worst mistakes of my life, but this is different. It's not like last time. I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I just need you to understand." The words hit Elias like a punch to the gut. He had thought that his heart had already bled dry from the last betrayal. He had thought that he had already weathered the storm and come out the other side. But now, standing in the echoes of that storm, Elias felt the sharp sting of shock, and anger rush through him again. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "So what? You're telling me that after everything, after Julian, after everything we went through, you've done it again?" "Yes," Celine replied, her voice cracking. "But it's not the same, Elias. I'm not with someone to escape from you. I thought it was over, but when I saw him again, I was weak, and I did it. But this time it's different. This time I see everything." The desperation in her voice was palpable, but Elias couldn't stop the flood of memories rushing back, the lies, the hurt, the feeling of being completely blindsided by her actions. How could she? He thought. How could she betray me again? "Who is it?" he asked, his voice cold and distant now. Selena hesitated before answering. "It's Julian." The name hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Elias's stomach churned. Julian. Again. The very thought of it was too much. The man who had once been his closest confidant, the man who had taken his wife, was now once again in the picture. Elias's rage, something he thought he had buried deep within him, began to rise. "You're telling me you're back with Julian after everything? After how he destroyed us both? After how he ruined everything?" Elias could feel his hands trembling with fury. I never meant for it to happen," Celine said desperately. "I never meant to hurt you again. But this time, I realized something. I've been lost for so long, trying to make sense of everything. Julian, he's the only one who understands the weight of what happened, the mistakes we made. We've both been broken. I didn't want to hurt you, Elias. But I was lonely. Elias didn't know whether to scream or to hang up the phone and walk away from the conversation altogether. The pain, once buried deep, surged again, as fresh as it had been the first time. "How long has this been going on?" Elias asked, his voice nearly a whisper now. "Months," Celine replied quietly, the shame in her voice undeniable. "I couldn't stay away. It's like we're both trapped in a cycle of pain. I don't know how to fix it." Elias's head spun. Months. With Julian. Again. He could feel the betrayal seeping into his bones once more, the sting of his past failures creeping back into every corner of his mind. He had thought he was free, that he had moved on, but this was too much, the breaking point. Elias knew that he could walk away. The investigation, unmasking the truth. Elias had always been a man of logic and reason. The betrayal that had shattered his life was something he never expected to face. Yet here he was again, staring at the cold, unyielding truth that his wife had cheated on him. But this time something was different. This time, he would not let his emotions cloud his judgment. He would do things methodically, like a detective peeling away layers of deceit to uncover the truth. His mind raced as he replayed the events over and over in his head. He couldn't escape the nagging feeling that something was off, that there were more details he hadn't yet seen, more threads left untied. He needed to know what had happened, to understand the full extent of his wife's betrayal. And so, he decided to investigate. The first clue. It started with small, seemingly insignificant things. A missed call from a number he didn't recognize, a message that was erased before he could read it, a change in the way his wife, Mara, looked at him. Cold, distant, as though she were hiding something. But there was one clue that he couldn't ignore: the sudden surge in her social media activity. She had always been somewhat active online, but lately there had been a change in her behavior. New friends, strange locations, private messages she wouldn't let him see. It was enough to spark his curiosity, and Elias knew that if he was going to get to the bottom of this, he needed to start with the one thing that was most accessible to him: her phone. The search. That night, when Mara was asleep beside him, Elias quietly reached over and unlocked her phone. His heart pounded in his chest as he scrolled through her messages, searching for anything that would give him an answer. It was like digging through a minefield, each tap on the screen bringing him closer to something that could break him again. There were messages to friends, family, even a few innocuous ones to co-workers. But then, he found it. A thread of messages, with a man named Daniel, someone Elias had never heard of before. At first, the conversation seemed innocent enough, small talk about work and social events. But then, the tone began to shift. The messages grew more personal: compliments on her appearance, invitations to meet up for coffee, flirty remarks. Elias's stomach tightened as he read through the thread, his mind racing with disbelief. Had this been going on for months? Was this the betrayal he had been blind to all along? His hands shook as he scrolled back through the entire conversation, his pulse quickening. One message stood out, a recent one that was sent just hours ago. "Can't wait to see you again tonight. I've missed you." Elias's heart sank. He felt the air leave his lungs as the weight of the message settled on him. So it's true, he thought. She's been seeing him behind my back. The next step. Elias knew he couldn't confront Mara with just this evidence. It wasn't enough. He needed more. He needed to understand the full scope of the betrayal. Who was Daniel? How long had this affair been going on? What else was his wife hiding? He set out to follow the breadcrumbs. The first thing Elias did was track down Daniel's identity. Using the phone number from the message, he ran a background check. What he found surprised him. Daniel was not just some random man from her workplace. He was a high-ranking executive at a company Elias had once worked with, an old acquaintance who had always been polite but distant. But that wasn't all. The more Elias dug into Daniel's life, the more connections he found between Daniel and Mara. There were dinners they'd shared at upscale restaurants, weekend getaways, even a trip abroad that Mara had claimed was a business trip. But when Elias looked deeper, he realized that Daniel had been with her the entire time. It was the perfect deception. Elias's blood boiled as he pieced together the puzzle. His wife, the woman he had loved and trusted, had been living a double life. The confrontation one evening after days of investigation, Elias finally had the full picture. He had seen enough to confirm that his suspicions were true. Mara had been cheating on him, not just with Daniel, but with several men over the course of their marriage. The betrayal had been going on for much longer than he had imagined. He stood in the living room, the house eerily quiet. His breath was steady, but his mind was racing. He knew that this moment would define everything, his marriage, his future. It would either be the end or a chance at some form of redemption, but there would be no turning back once he confronted her. When Mara walked in through the door, looking surprised to see him standing there, Elias felt the familiar pang of hurt. She had no idea that he had uncovered everything. But that would change now. "Mara," he said, his voice calm, almost too calm. "We need to talk." She froze. The tension in the air was palpable. The price of betrayal. The days following Elias's confrontation with Mara felt like a haze of uncertainty and quiet rage. Every morning, he woke to the echoes of his own thoughts, replaying the conversations, the lies, and the slow unraveling of a marriage that he had once believed would last forever. Yet, even as he packed his belongings, made arrangements to start over, and searched for the closure he so desperately craved, a darker side of him began to emerge. The side that had been silenced, buried beneath years of trust and love. That side was demanding justice, not just for the betrayal of his wife, but for everything he had endured. It wanted revenge. It wasn't about retribution in the traditional sense. Elias had no desire to hurt anyone physically. Instead, it was about making Mara understand the consequences of her actions, the true weight of the destruction she had caused. She had torn apart his world without a second thought, and now he was going to make sure she faced the repercussions in a way she could never ignore. The plan begins. Elias was no longer the passive, trusting man who had stood by his wife through thick and thin. He had become a strategist, someone who would use Mara's own deceit against her. It started with something small but powerful, her reputation. It wasn't just the affair with Daniel that had devastated Elias. It was the way Mara had handled the betrayal. She had treated him like a fool, lying right to his face, even as he confronted her with irrefutable evidence. No remorse. No accountability. She had always prided herself on being the perfect wife in front of others, while behind closed doors, she had been anything but. Elias knew how much Mara valued her social standing, her reputation in their circle of friends, her image as a devoted wife, and the illusion of a perfect family. That's where he would strike first. He began gathering every detail he could about her, conversations she'd had, the way she had manipulated situations, the lies she had woven. He compiled everything, meticulously documenting every instance of her deceit. Then, he planned to expose it, not just to her, but to everyone in their circle. The social web Elias began with Mara's closest friends, the people who had spent years in her inner circle. He used subtlety and finesse, allowing them to believe that the conversations were innocent, just a man trying to get some closure. But as he shared small bits of information, his words were carefully chosen to plant seeds of doubt. One of her friends, Isabella, a woman Mara had always considered her confidant, was the first to bite. Elias told her about the affair with Daniel, casually mentioning how he had learned of the relationship. He didn't make any accusations, just told her the truth as he had uncovered it. Slowly, the whispers began to spread, and soon Mara's carefully crafted facade began to crack. As Elias continued his campaign, he found that people began to question Mara's integrity. It wasn't just the affair. It was the realization that for years, she had been hiding the truth from everyone. She was no longer the untouchable, perfect wife. She had become just another woman who had betrayed those closest to her. Elias watched as Mara's world began to shift, the social walls that had once protected her now crumbling. She no longer had the same command over her friends and acquaintances. Her image, built over years of deception, was slipping away. But that was only the beginning. The final blow. Elias knew that Mara's betrayal had touched him personally. But there was one final thing he had to do to truly make her understand the cost of her actions. He would take away the one thing that mattered to her most, the life they had built together. He had learned from their years of marriage, from the small details she had casually let slip, what Mara valued most. It wasn't just her social standing. It was their shared financial assets, the house, the investments, the business ventures. They had carefully cultivated together. In many ways, she had made her mark on their wealth, thinking that it was all part of a life she had built with him, on his back. But Elias had other plans. Over the next few weeks, he methodically shifted the balance of their finances. He moved his assets, secured his investments, and sought legal advice. Using the evidence of her infidelity, he knew that he could claim a significant portion of their shared wealth. But he didn't stop there. He secretly contacted Daniel's employer, hinting at the nature of the relationship between him and Mara. The affair, while personal, had become a liability for Daniel's career as well. Elias didn't care for the man's career, but it was satisfying to know that every connection Mara had built in that world was being tested by the very betrayal she had committed. The final reckoning. Elias had spent months carefully orchestrating his revenge, watching as Mara's life slowly crumbled. It had been a war of attrition, a calculated dismantling of everything she had built. But what he didn't expect was the slow, almost imperceptible shift within himself. Revenge, which had started as a fiery drive for justice, had now begun to feel less like an answer and more like a hollow pursuit. It wasn't that he regretted what he had done. No, Mara's betrayal had warranted a response, and he had delivered it. But the satisfaction he had expected was fleeting, like a flame that burned bright for a moment before flickering out. As his actions had echoed through Mara's life, Elias had seen her unravel in ways he couldn't have predicted. The loss of friends, her business partners turning their backs, the public disgrace, it had all been painful for her. But it had been painful for him, too. What had started as a battle for his dignity and sense of self-worth had become something far more complicated. A fight that had started with anger, but now lingered with an eerie emptiness. The encounter won. Evening, as Elias sat in his favorite cafe, sipping his coffee, he saw a familiar figure across the room. It was Mara, though she hardly resembled the woman he had once known. She looked tired, worn down by the weight of her own choices. Her eyes, once full of confidence, were now clouded with regret. The smile that had once charmed everyone in the room had faded into a grimace of defeat. It had been months since their last confrontation, and Elias had deliberately avoided seeing her, fearing that his lingering feelings might disrupt the cold finality he had created. But there she was, in the same place they had once shared coffee, when their world had seemed perfect, before the lies had surfaced and shattered it all. Mara glanced around, and when her eyes met Elias's, there was no more denial in them. There was only the stark truth of someone who had lost everything and was now facing the aftermath of their actions. For a moment, neither of them moved. It was as if the universe had put them in the same space for one final conversation. No more games, No more pretenses. Mara stood, her hands shaking slightly as she approached him. But she didn't sit. She couldn't. There was too much between them now, too much that had been said and done. "You've won, Elias," she said quietly, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. "I've lost everything, and it's all my fault." Elias didn't respond immediately. He had imagined this moment countless times, each time with different outcomes. But now that it was here, he didn't feel the triumph he expected. He only felt tired. "Mara, you made your choices," he finally said, his voice steady but distant. "You destroyed everything we had. You betrayed me, not once, but repeatedly, and you thought you could get away with it. I had to take control back, take what was mine. But now, after all of it, I'm left wondering if it was worth it." Her face fell, and her eyes glistened with tears she had clearly been holding back. "I was wrong. I know that. And I can't take any of it back. I can't undo what I did." Elias looked at her, really looked at her. Gone was the confident, untouchable woman who had once stood before him, untarnished and powerful. In her place was a broken soul, one who had burned every bridge she had crossed. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Mara continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for everything, and I know it doesn't change anything. I don't deserve anything from you." Elias exhaled slowly. He had imagined this moment of confrontation, of seeing Mara break down and finally take responsibility for her actions. But now that it was real, it didn't feel like the victory he had anticipated. Instead, it felt like the end of something, long past its prime. Like the last chapter of a book that should have been closed long ago. "Do you know what I've learned?" Elias said quietly, his gaze locked on her. "Revenge doesn't heal the wounds. It doesn't make the pain go away. All it does is leave you with an empty feeling. And in the end, it's not about what we do to the other person. It's about what it does to us." Mara's tears fell freely now, the weight of everything crashing down on her. She had expected Elias to lash out, to revel in her suffering. But instead, she saw the person she had once known in a different light. It wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about the cost of their shared history, the love that had been poisoned by lies, and the way their lives had spiraled because of a single betrayal. "I didn't want this," she whispered, as though the words could somehow undo the damage. "I never wanted any of this. I just thought I could escape, but now look at me. I'm left with nothing." The conclusion. Elias didn't know what to say. The web of lies. Elias had always considered himself a man of patience. After the first shock of discovery, he realized that in order to understand the full extent of Mara's betrayal, he needed to approach this methodically, almost like a detective in his own life. He had seen glimpses of the lies that had unfolded, but now he sought the full picture. Every hidden detail, every secret Mara had buried beneath the surface of their marriage. The first step in his investigation was subtle. He began by monitoring the smallest of her actions: her phone, her email, and even casual conversations with friends. The trust that had once been at the core of their relationship had crumbled, leaving behind an icy void. But Elias had learned something important from his years of loyalty. If you want to find the truth, you need to look where no one expects. The digital trail. One evening, while Mara was out for a routine dinner with friends, Elias sat down at her laptop, his heart pounding as his fingers hovered over the keyboard. He had always respected her privacy, but now every inch of that respect seemed misplaced in the face of her betrayal. He went straight to the messaging app, something that Mara used regularly to communicate with family, friends, and colleagues. At first, there was nothing out of the ordinary, but Elias knew that sometimes betrayal wasn't found in obvious messages. It was the things left unsaid, the gaps in communication, the patterns that didn't add up. He scrolled deeper and found it, the thread of messages between Mara and Daniel. At first, there were the innocuous exchanges, messages about work, about their day-to-day lives, peppered with pleasantries. But as Elias continued to scroll, the tone shifted. More frequent, more intimate messages appeared. Simple questions like, "How's your day going?" soon gave way to playful remarks, flirtations, and then something that made Elias stop in his tracks. A message that made his chest tighten with a coldness he hadn't yet felt. "Mara, I can't stop thinking about last night. I want more of that." Elias's breath caught in his throat. The weight of that line fell heavily upon him. He quickly skimmed through the rest of their conversation, finding enough evidence to confirm the affair. His stomach churned with each new message that painted a picture he was not ready to face. But that wasn't enough. Elias needed to know more. He needed to understand how deep this betrayal had truly gone. The missing hours. Elias turned his attention to something more difficult to trace: Mara's recent whereabouts. She had always been careful, but he knew that there were gaps in her stories. During her late nights out, her insistence on vague details about where she had been or with whom, those small inconsistencies were enough to keep him on edge. His first lead came from a colleague at her workplace who casually mentioned seeing Mara and Daniel leave the office together late one evening. The comment was innocent, an offhand remark during a conversation, but it was all Elias needed. The pieces were falling into place. With a growing sense of unease, Elias set out to track the days Mara had been absent without a reasonable explanation. He went through old calendars, flight records, and even receipts from their joint accounts, searching for signs of where she had gone. It was like unraveling a puzzle that didn't make sense at first glance, but slowly started to form a clear image. One particular weekend, Mara had gone on a trip she had called work-related, a weekend retreat with some colleagues. Or at least that's what she had told Elias. But when Elias cross-checked the dates with her credit card activity, something didn't match. There was a significant purchase made in a small town they had both visited together early in their relationship, a town known for its scenic countryside and small romantic inns. Elias felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. He knew then what he had to do. He needed to confront her with the truth he had discovered. But there was one more thing. He wanted to verify one final piece of evidence that would leave no room for doubt. The confrontation. The following evening, Elias waited for Mara to return from her latest business dinner, her phone buzzing quietly on the kitchen counter. He had all the evidence he needed now, the messages, the inconsistencies, the financial trail. But he needed to hear it from her own lips, the confession, the admittance of guilt that would seal the chapter on this relationship. Mara entered, her face lighting up when she saw him sitting there, a glass of wine in hand, as if nothing had changed. She looked the same. Except to Elias, she no longer seemed like the woman he had married. "Mara," Elias began, his voice steady but cold. "We need to talk." Her expression faltered for just a second, a subtle shift that didn't go unnoticed. She set her purse down and took a seat, trying to maintain her composure. The shattered pieces. Elias had never anticipated how hollow revenge could feel. Months of meticulous planning, endless hours of gathering evidence, watching as Mara's life unraveled, had all led to this moment. The final act of retaliation was complete. And yet there was no sense of victory. Instead, a quiet emptiness lingered, settling heavily within him. He had exacted his revenge, made her pay for her betrayal, but in the process, he had lost something of himself. Mara's life was now in tatters. The affair with Daniel, which Elias had exposed with surgical precision, had spread through every corner of her social and professional life. Her friends had distanced themselves. The whispers followed her like a shadow. And yet, as Elias sat in the dimly lit apartment that had once been a symbol of their shared life, he couldn't bring himself to feel satisfaction. Instead, there was the suffocating weight of regret, a sense that the price of revenge was far steeper than he had imagined. The silence of aftermath. The days passed in a blur of unanswered phone calls and empty nights. Mara had left the house, unable to bear the weight of the consequences. Elias had expected that. She had nowhere left to go but away from him, from the life they had built. But it was the silence that unnerved him. The absence of her presence, the once familiar noise of their daily routine, now felt like a void, a hole that he had no idea how to fill. It wasn't the anger that kept him up at night. No, it was the realization that their love had never been what he had imagined it to be. Trust, once shattered, could never be fully restored. Love, when tainted with lies, became a shadow of its former self. His revenge had severed the ties completely, and now he was left with nothing but the echoes of a marriage that had never been what it seemed. The call from the past. Then one evening, an unexpected phone call came. It was from an old friend, someone who had known Elias and Mara from the beginning of their relationship. Simon, a longtime confidant, had stayed in touch with both of them over the years. Simon's voice, usually so steady, carried a tone of concern that caught Elias off guard. "Elias, I think you need to hear this," Simon said after a long pause. Elias sat up straight, his heart racing. "What is it?" "I don't know how to say this, but I think you should know what Mara has been going through after all this. What you've done has devastated her. I get that she messed up, but this isn't the way to handle it." Elias clenched his jaw, hearing the words Simon spoke, but not fully understanding their meaning. Devastated her? She deserved everything that happened. She betrayed me. She lied. "I know," Simon interrupted gently, "but you're destroying yourself in the process. I've seen it. She's been crying nonstop. She can't even look herself in the mirror. I get that you wanted justice, but this isn't justice, Elias. This is self-destruction." Elias's mind spun. He had believed he was merely righting the wrongs, balancing the scales of betrayal. But Simon's words struck deeper than any accusation. Was this really revenge, or was it a blind act that was consuming everyone around him? The echoes of his own pain had reverberated outward, leaving scars on people he hadn't intended to hurt. For the first time since beginning his revenge, Elias stopped and took a long, hard look at the person he had become. The decision. The next morning, Elias drove to the small apartment Mara had moved into. He hadn't spoken to her since he had revealed the affair, and he didn't know what he was hoping to accomplish by going. The need for closure? An apology for what had transpired? Or perhaps in some strange way, he was looking for the answer to the question that had been plaguing him since the beginning. Was revenge ever truly worth it? When Mara opened the door, her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed. She had clearly been crying for days. There was no defiance in her posture, no anger or resentment, only exhaustion. Exhaustion from the weight of her choices and the consequences she had faced. "Elias," her voice faltered. "What are you doing here?" He didn't know how to explain it. He had come to bring closure, but instead, he was uncertain of what that meant. "Mara," he began, his voice softer than he intended. "I wanted to hurt you. I thought that by exposing your betrayal, by watching everything fall apart, I'd find peace. But instead, I just feel empty." She looked at him with a mixture of shame and sorrow. "I never wanted to hurt you. You have to believe that." I was selfish. I was wrong, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But Elias, you're right. There's nothing left for either of us in this." He stood there, wrestling with the swirling storm of emotions inside him. She had admitted to her wrongs, and he had done the same. But this wasn't about justice or revenge anymore. It was about finding a way forward. The price of revenge. Elias had spent months meticulously orchestrating his revenge on Mara, each action designed to hit her where it would hurt the most. He had exposed the affair, watched as her life crumbled before her, and taken solace in the small victories along the way. He had thought that once he'd exacted his revenge, he would feel a sense of closure. But as the days stretched on, something began to gnaw at him. A cold realization that no amount of retribution could undo the hurt that had festered within him. The damage to Mara was done. She had lost friends, respect in her professional life, and most of all her marriage. But the cost to Elias was something he hadn't anticipated. Revenge had consumed him, and now it had left him hollow. A man who had traded his sense of justice for bitterness and anger. The hollow aftermath. The nights were the hardest, when the adrenaline of plotting and executing his revenge had worn off. Elias found himself lying awake in the silence of their shared home. The memories of the life they once had, the quiet mornings over coffee, the shared laughter, the feeling of being truly seen and understood, were now nothing more than distant echoes. He had crushed those moments, convinced that destroying Mara's world would somehow restore his own. But the reality was stark. He had destroyed everything, including himself. It wasn't just the bitterness of the betrayal that haunted him anymore. It was the realization that, in his quest for vengeance, he had become someone he didn't recognize, a man whose actions were driven by anger rather than principle. He had allowed the darkness of revenge to swallow him whole. The visit. Then, one evening, there was a knock at the door. Elias opened it to find Mara standing on the threshold, her expression unreadable. She had changed. The confident, sometimes brash woman he had once known was gone, replaced by someone who appeared more fragile, broken by the consequences of her own mistakes. Her eyes were red-rimmed and her face was pale. She hadn't come to beg for his forgiveness or to explain herself again. No, her visit had a different purpose. "Elias," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to talk to you." He didn't invite her in, but he didn't shut the door either. His chest tightened as he took in the sight of her, standing in front of him as if the last few months hadn't been filled with all the lies, the pain, and the devastation. "What is it, Mara?" "I came here because I need to ask you something," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of unspoken words. "I came here because I know I destroyed you. I know I hurt you in ways that I'll never be able to fix. But what you've done to me, what you've done to both of us, it's not making you any better. You're drowning in this hate, Elias, and I'm worried it's going to kill you." The words hit him like a slap. He had expected her to apologize, to beg him to take her back. But instead, Mara was offering him a wake-up call, and it cut deeper than anything he had done to her. The unseen cost. Elias stared at her for a long moment, the weight of her words sinking in. He had thought he was punishing her, thought he was somehow finding justice for the betrayal, but in reality, he was digging his own grave. "You're right," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "I don't know when I became this person. When I started focusing so much on hurting you, I lost sight of who I was. I lost myself." Mara's eyes softened, but she didn't move any closer. "I know you think I deserve all of this, but revenge doesn't bring peace, Elias. It just keeps the wounds fresh. It keeps you in a place where you can never heal." Elias didn't know how to respond. He had spent so much of his life focused on retribution that he hadn't even realized he had become a shell of the person he used to be. There had been a time, long before the betrayal, when he had believed in justice, when he had believed that actions had consequences, but those consequences could lead to growth and understanding. Now, though, all he felt was a gnawing emptiness, a hunger for something that didn't exist anymore. "Mara," he said quietly, "what do I do now?" She didn't answer immediately, instead looking down at the ground, perhaps considering whether there was anything left to say. Finally, she spoke. "Maybe the question isn't about what you do now. Maybe it's about who you become." Elias wasn't sure what that meant. But he could feel something stirring within him, something that hadn't been there for a long time, a flicker of hope. It was fragile, like a candle in the wind, but it was there, a spark that could light the way forward if only he was willing to follow it. The road ahead. After Mara left, Elias found himself walking through the quiet house once more, but this time the silence felt different. He was no longer chasing after the ghosts of the past, trying to punish them.